Getting started.
No lights. I hope you don't get shot by the police. No lights on this side at the back.
Yeah. Alright, can you do GPS?
Okay, let me just see what terminal we're going to. Lisbon. Okay. Oh, it's only. Okay, boarding at 9:30. Okay, the airport. Okay. Only domestic airport. Which airport am I going to?
The mental importance of it, especially.
I'm going.
Dickinson writes, "Hope is the thing with feathers."
Okay, just
Yeah.
hold on.
Hold
I
on,
got
hold
focus.
on. Let me try to pause it. Assistive reader.
Where's the? There's mainly domestic.
Who is this person?
Text includes over 1,000 metaphors.
What the hell is that? Why is that happening, Dad?
This is not to say that the simple left-brain form of understanding isn't ever in agreement with
Or share a hotspot with me, so that I don't have to use your battery.
Hold on. I just want to make sure we got the right airport.
License right there.
I don't know whether that doesn't look right to me.
What? Let's see. That looks right to me. What's wrong?
Okay, there you go. And you want to share the hotspot?
Share the hotspot.
Settings. Yeah, others can join, you know, so.
Oh, great. Then I'm gonna join the hotspot. If you don't mind. Whoa, have you changed the password, buddy? Share hotspot. Share a hotspot.
You done it? Got it?
Done it. What is that?
Where's my bag? It's here.
What happened? What's this? Oh, that's not it. Ah, here it is.
You want a light?
Alright, all set.
Okay, let's get a photo of the car. Okay.
Okay.
And pointed to a picture of a chicken. Then things got more interesting. The experimenter asked the patient the left and right sides of the brain. These patients were referred to as split brain patients. To understand this research, it is also important to know that the body is cross-wired. That is, all the input and output from the right half of the body crosses over and is processed. This is not to say that the simple left brain form of understanding isn't ever in agreement with reality. Sometimes, if I replace the muffler in my car, the sound does go away. If I take an antacid, my stomach does feel better. This form of understanding has been instrumental in those breakthroughs that gave us flight, took us to the moon, and now has us moving about in cars that drive themselves. While seeing one thing at a time is a necessary and useful process, it is fundamentally dependent on the larger vision taking place in the right brain. This is ironic when you consider how the left brain masquerades as the master. We need the right brain to understand the purpose of a car or our digestive system, and only then can we focus on the specific parts that construct these larger processes. Metaphor. Let's try and put this together in a model that the left brain can understand better, because your right brain already gets it. A good way to do that is through metaphor and simile, the latter being a form of metaphor. In order for metaphor to mean anything at all, one must be able to make connections that are not apparent while focusing on the linear parts only. For instance, in trying to first describe what love is, one might say, love is like a rose, beautiful but with thorns that can hurt sometimes. At work we can get ahead, fall behind, or make it to the top. In these metaphors, we are mapping an abstraction onto a perception. While metaphors call on both the left and right brain, here again it is the left that relies on the right. Metaphors make connections that are beyond literal meaning, even if the left brain sometimes takes them to be literal. Imagine if someone offered you an idea that was food for thought, but you refused,
714.
explaining that you just ate. Similarly, thinking that the universe is a clock-like machine might be a useful metaphor. Given free rein with this metaphor, however, the left brain might lead us straight down a literal path to a tragic conclusion. What if we are also only a machine within an ever larger lifeless machine? This line of thinking will most certainly lead to suffering. Equating perception with understanding is the essence of metaphor. We take something abstract and connect it to a right brain experience, hoping that the left brain will get it. There's a large body of research showing the right brain is critical in metaphor, and that individuals
So you've never
the
taken
right
this
brain
vehicle
will
into
take
an electrical
poems,
check-up then?
metaphors,
No. 2024 India 01 Goldie 1238. Okay, so you've been watching this dash cam footage. So I was wrong. I'm going to it. Hold on, where am I gonna put this video?
sarcasm literally. To take a metaphor literally is to miss the connection. There's a long tradition in both philosophy and religion of using metaphors in the quest for understanding, especially in the East. The Pali Canon is the collection of writings typically considered the best record of the Buddha's teachings. This text includes over 1,000 metaphors. In Buddhism, the mind is like a pool because its water clears when left alone. Lily Dickinson writes, "Hope is the thing with feathers."
Yeah. That's the point I'm making. No, but right. The point is that but it wouldn't make any sense for us to maybe simultaneous activity, for instance, in the amygdala, but it wouldn't make any sense. Okay, this is what I'm wrong about. So, all right. So we've learned some cool stuff, and this whole conversation's murky for me. I don't understand what the disagreement is actually. I know that my objection to him is I just hear, and I don't know, I'd have to do a analysis to prove it, but I just have the impression, first of all, that we're disagreeing about something. Okay, how did this start? Superior colliculus, which is because that's you get. We do not behave through emotion. We don't first need to experience. What's wrong about that?
If something came charging towards you immediately. No, the base self responds to emotion.
So I was. Let me ask you something. If the fundamental unit of the brain is, maybe you could argue it's the synapse, maybe you could argue it's the neuron. What is the fundamental unit of the mind?
Of the mind?
Yeah.
Well, what is the mind?
The mind is whatever you think the mind is. And I'm pretty sure we have the same concept. So what is the fundamental unit of the mind? What is the fundamental unit of psychological mechanism?
Oh, I've no idea. The psychological mechanisms.
That's what the mind is, right? The psyche.
Yeah. Does it have a fundamental unit? I don't know. Like, if you think about electricity, I don't know what fundamental unit of the thinking process. Is that what you're talking about? Actual thought?
Uh-huh. I'll tell you what it is. It's an it. It's a single if-then mechanism that takes one piece of information and produces one output. You understand?
Yeah, I understand.
Huh?
I understand.
So that's the fundamental unit of the mind.
Okay. So this is a whole pattern of if-thens.
That's right. That's exactly right. And they can form teams, modules. Absolutely. And each it can be broken down into smaller its.
Well, it's not a fundamental unit.
It is, because it's being broken down into its. You can refer to those its that are being broken down as what we call soup its, and you're breaking it down into its parts.
Like the molecules.
Yeah, exactly. A molecule can be broken down into,
Atoms.
into atoms.
Atoms can be broken down into electrons, protons.
Yeah, and likewise, so an it is like an atom. Now, sometimes you'll refer to an it, but you're really talking about a molecule, and you could break it down. It's just a question of how you categorize it.
But isn't it more fluid than that? The thought doesn't have any cohesion. It's not changing. It's constantly changing. It's
Um,
not a fixed thing.
Yeah, so a given thought would probably be a set of its.
It's not like, yeah, but it's not discrete. It's, okay, yeah.
So you could break it down into a number of different processing rules, each one taking a particular condition and producing an output. So for instance, you can have if threat, then run, then flight. If threat, then flight. Now that can be broken down. You need to name the threat. So if something charging towards me, then threat. Or sorry, if something charging towards me, then flight. That can be broken down into if something charging towards me, then threat. If threat, then fight or flight. If fight or flight, then flight. I mean, and plus whatever other conditions are involved to make it flight rather than fight. You understand?
Of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. Because, you could pretend you're fleeing and then they come after you and then you trip them up or something.
So it can be more complicated than that.
It's always more complicated.
Well, all right. Well, what I've done is I've given you an example of how an it is the element of the mind. Now, your it can be more nuanced than that if you like, but in that example, that sufficed. As far as that it in the system, there are other its involved in the system, so that's understood that your mind is not a singular it. But no, the element is not more complicated than that. One such element, just like you can have a hydrogen atom. You can say the world's more complicated than a hydrogen atom, yes. But if someone's just giving you an example of a hydrogen atom, then that is not more complicated than that. But yes, there's also H2O, there's lots of things. So I was thrown off because, not that this is why I was wrong, I had the wrong idea. I was thrown off because, no! Because what I'm trying to talk about the thousands, the millions of components that create the self. And you could identify a couple dozen of these that are particularly strong in you. Particularly sensitive or particularly influential, such as I don't know, some oxytocin it, like an in-group out-group it, like if they are of my community, then I will fiercely defend them. And maybe because that it is strong, maybe it's tends to be at the same level, I don't know, as its counterpart, which is if that is a member of the out group, then I will fiercely defend against them. And it's I see, because you think it is a behavioral description. It is not. It is a psychological vote. So there is an it that says, plain and simple, thing charging towards me, run. Now there's another it that might say, you know what, thing charging towards me, wave my arms in the air. Another one that says, thing charging towards me, make noise. And it's the question of the interplay between these and which one wins out according to their calibrations. But each element is simple. The complexity arises from the interaction between the elements.
Set.
It would be worthwhile knowing, relative to either the mean or what's moral, depending on the societal ideals, where your mechanisms stand. so that you can, take responsibility for that. Don't go becoming a judge if you know that you have that, because then if you see a member of your in group versus a member of your out group, that shit's gonna go crazy.
Einstein, he came up with the general relativity, and then he wanted to extend it, and then he wrote this letter to some professor in Leiden. Says,
Professor what?
A professor in Leiden in Germany.
Okay.
Or the Netherlands, I can't remember which. And I think it's the Netherlands. And he said he's told us he's extended the theory, but some people maybe think I belong in the nut house.
Yeah.
And they want to put me away. Please tell me there are no nut houses in Leiden. I mean, it's just an amazing thing that everybody, and probably a lot of people today, think that time is the same throughout the entire universe. Like 1 hour on Earth is the same as 1 hour on some distant galaxy. Like time is moving forward uniformly throughout the universe.
As though it's not a matter of physics.
Yeah, so it was only when he came up with the special relativity, general relativity, that was. I'm sure a lot of people imagine time as flows, and it's completely separate from the idea of space. Actually, it wasn't even Einstein who came up with the space-time thing. That was Minkowski.
Who?
Minkowski.
I haven't heard of that.
Yeah, he came up just before he came up. I'm not sure how long before Einstein developed it into the theory of gravity and space-time and the rest of that.
By breaking the self down into its components, you can figure out who the major players are for yourself, for an individual self. Which elements, which mechanisms are very sensitive and have great influence.
The primate, yeah.
Huh?
The primate self. No, the base self, which responds to emotion. So if something came charging towards you, you immediately are frightened. So you have that sense of being frightened.
Yeah, the sense of fear would probably happen after the behavioral response is already initiated.
No, I would think that would be the first thing that's initiated.
No, I don't think that's what the research says. We do not behave through emotion. We don't first need to experience an emotion and then decide what to do.
It's experience an emotion, right?
No,
that's the first thing. It is.
You're affirming that?
Yeah.
Now you have to say based on what? Because you've already affirmed that.
Well, because that's
Now you may think that matches your experience.
You hear a loud bang behind you, and immediately your body reacts.
Yeah.
And there's no thought process going on.
No.
Your body immediately reacts to it.
Right.
And then I'm going to move out.
So I'm going to explain it to you now. So there's a structure in the brainstem which is called the superior colliculus, which has nothing to do with emotion, which is going to be involved in directing attention immediately. It's a reflex brainstem, immediate. Now, there may be simultaneous activity, for instance, in the amygdala, but it wouldn't make any sense for us to evolve such that it always has to go through the amygdala before the amygdala initiates a fear response.
So it's like a base, an early part of the brain evolutionarily developed that first response.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the point I'm making.
No, but the point is that there's the reptilian brain, then there's the mammalian brain where you're going to have your limbic system.
It's the primate brain.
Right. So.
It's a human.
Yeah, I guess. So there's the cortex, the
the point is, there's like different levels of self. Self is a unitary thing.
Right, that's what you're learning now, recently. Unfortunately not from me, but yes, I can confirm that for you. I feel like I'm not hearing questions. I feel like I'm hearing you affirm things that you may have read in some Psych Today article. And you're going to be wanting to protect your in-group member against the out-group member at the expense of the details of the case. Okay? Because that's a strong System 1. And System 2 is like, all right, I'll leave it to you. Okay? All right. So, okay, now he's talking about, now he's starting to do these layers of selves, almost this like id and ego stuff, it sounds like, where he's saying there's the base self that, and I think that this self, and here's one of my objections, is that this self is like metaphysical. He wouldn't agree to that. He would say, no, of course it isn't. But the way he talks about it, it is. It would be this like self that deals with the biological emotions, that makes judgments based on them. And then there would be a second leveled self that's a little bit, it uses information. So the information in the brain, that self uses that. And that's not really what we're talking about. I mean, yeah, you could say that definitely it's... All right, come on, let's chat more in an hour. Let's enjoy this now. What do you say?
Yeah.
And writes, hope is the thing with feathers. And if someone offered you an idea that was food for thought, but you refused, explaining that you just ate. Similarly, thinking that the universe is a clock-like machine might be a useful metaphor. Given free rein with this metaphor, however, the left brain might lead us straight down a literal path to a tragic conclusion. What if we are also only a machine within an ever larger lifeless machine? This line of thinking will most certainly lead to suffering.
It does not have to.
Equating perception with understanding is the essence of metaphor. We take something abstract and connect it to a right brain experience, hoping that the left brain will get it. There's a large body of research showing the right brain is critical in metaphor, and that individuals with damage to the right brain will take poems, metaphors, and sarcasm literally. To take a metaphor literally is to miss the connection. There's a long tradition in both philosophy and religion of using metaphors in the quest for understanding, especially in the East. The Pali Canon is the collection of writings typically considered the best record of the Buddha's teachings. This text includes over 1,000 metaphors. In Buddhism, the mind is like a pool because its water clears when left alone, and the middle path conveys moderation. Even the phrase, the Buddha, is grounded in metaphor, because the original Pali term simply means one who is awake. If taken literally, this would mean that anyone who isn't sleeping is a Buddha, though of course being awake in this context means being conscious of reality, rather than hypnotized by our dreamlike stories about reality. With metaphor, the brain is making a connection between a pattern of neural activity and the real, genuine world. Metaphor is also the very heart of poetry. As Emily Dickinson writes, "Hope is the thing with feathers." There is no hope in taking this literally, but the right brain sees the unusual way in which hope and feathers are connected. In this sense, perception itself is like poetry, and our most basic conscious experiences are like writing a poem. Perhaps the reason Buddhism and other spiritual traditions use metaphors so frequently is because they sidestep the gatekeeping functions of the interpretive mind. On the surface, most metaphors seem simple and innocent, so the interpreter doesn't engage any of its defenses. By the time the right brain is active, experience has already transcended the left brain to some degree. Unlike the verbal silence that is going on in the right brain, the vast majority of happenings in the left side are about other ideas, or ideas, in a sort of self-generated bureaucratic machine. Of course, these stories and interpretations are all abstractions. So one could say that what is going on in the left brain is countless images reflected in water with no substance. Or, as a Zen Buddhist might say, the mind is like water.
You didn't leave anything in the washing machine, right?
Spatial processing. As mentioned in the last chapter, the right brain is key in spatial processing. Rather than focusing on one thing at a time, the right brain senses the whole picture, both the things themselves and the spaces in between. One could say that the right brain understands that a figure is determined by its background, something the left brain tends to overlook. The truth is that no figure could exist without the background, and the shape of the background is dependent upon the figure. This is so simple that you might miss the fundamental importance of it, especially if you are over-identifying with the left brain. For instance, let's go back to kindergarten for a moment and think of something as simple as the difference between the idea of 1 and 2. What is this difference? It isn't a thing that turns 1 into 2, but rather the space between. A space between 1 creates 2. And what is the difference between 2 and 3? Again, just more space. And what is 4 but adding more space? Things are intrinsically linked to space. Space connects. Space creates all things. Yet if you remember the quick exercise we did in Chapter 1, the left brain interpreter only focused on the objects in a room, and you likely did not even consider the empty space when listing what you saw. The yin-yang symbol of Taoism expresses this truth perfectly. The white is necessary to see the black, and the black is necessary to see the white. There is an understanding here that can't be grasped by the left brain, a message these ancient masters conveyed to us with an image. Just as the background defines the figure, space defines all the things in the world, because space is the ultimate background. Without space or emptiness, no separate things could exist. This suggests why Buddhism, particularly Zen Buddhism, has such a romance with emptiness and space, because these things make everything else possible. Consider this section from the Heart Sutra of Mahayana Buddhism. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not separate from form. Form is not separate from emptiness. Whatever is form is emptiness. Whatever is emptiness is form. Often said to be Buddhism in a nutshell, this excerpt is used to meditate around the interconnected ideas of emptiness and form in a way that brings the two together, rather than creating categorical separations. Consider the act of reading. The words on this page are so interdependent on their surroundings that we cannot separate the word and its background. The words only stand out because they are different from the background. The space between the lines and curves that make up the letters are equally as important as the letters themselves. In a way, it is almost as if the space is more important, since it is the space between the parts that creates the difference between one word and everything else. If reality were an ocean, the left brain could only take in one wave at a time. The right brain sees the vastness of the sea all at once. Both of these are a kind of image of reality rather than reality itself. No matter how the ocean is taken in, the ocean does not change its nature. Only its appearance changes. But because the right brain is sensing the entire picture, including the empty space, rather than just the objects in space one at a time as the left brain does, reality is more closely represented in the right brain. The right brain senses the world in parallel, all at once, while the left brain senses the world in series, one thing at a time. It is standard in psychology to refer to parallel forms of processing as unconscious, in exactly the same way it treats digestive and respiratory systems as unconscious. Again, the left brain is considered the master of reality, and the right brain is portrayed as unconscious. I hope that you are now starting to realize that this is simply not the case. Rather, the right brain is a form of consciousness that does not rely on words. According to Eastern philosophical schools, not relying on words is a wonderful way to be, and might well decrease the suffering of humankind. Explorations. Space exercise for consciousness. Moving from Earth into outer space can have the effect of directing consciousness out of the interpretive mind, as astronaut and moonwalker Edgar Mitchell noted. What I experienced during that 3-day trip home was nothing short of an overwhelming sense of universal connectedness. I actually felt what has been described as an ecstasy of unity. I perceived the universe as in some way conscious. The thought was so large it seemed inexpressible, and to a large degree it still is. It's a little ironic that we need to go into outer space to appreciate the power of the space that we have not only failed to notice, but also failed to notice that we have failed to notice. There seems to be agreement among scientists that only 5% of our universe is made up of what we might consider typical matter. So perhaps in outer space, it just becomes more obvious that space is more prevalent than matter. Stuck on the familiar perspective of Earth's landscape, the left brain can more easily tell the story that matter is more important. For this exercise, I invite you to redirect awareness to the space between your hands, the space between you and the next person you see, the space between any objects in front of you now. There is so much space that there are infinite variations of this practice, and you don't have to leave Earth to experience it. One practice is to look outward into the night sky and focus on the space between things. There's something about space that slows the mind, since the mind has no way to understand it because it has no content and no container. Therefore, when we shift our awareness to it, the interpretive mind slows down. The silence in between. Without space, no thing is possible, and without silence, no sound is possible. Noticing how the sounds of many things depend on the silence in the background can be very helpful in exploring the concepts we've been...
No self, no problem. How neuropsychology is catching up to Buddhism by Dr. Chris Niebauer.
When you listen to someone speak, or when you speak yourself, bring some attention to the silent space.
Yeah.
So I should have a mic then.
Yeah.
Right?
The sounds. Can you sense, in the same way a figure is dependent on the background, that sound is dependent on silence? Without silence, sound would have no meaning. Consider how these two explorations relate to the Buddhist mantra, form is void, void is form. Chapter 6. Right brain intelligence, intuition, emotions, and creativity. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift. Albert Einstein. Zen Buddhism has a teaching called Prajnaparamita, which is typically translated as the perfection of wisdom. It's important to point out that the wisdom referred to here is not the same as intellectual knowledge, but a type of insight into the nature of reality that is beyond language and reasoning. Prajna is also referred to in Zen writings as wisdom beyond wisdom. This kind of wisdom is very much connected to the teaching on emptiness we reviewed at the end of the last chapter, since this type of wisdom allows you to make the connection between empty space and matter. Given the emphasis on nonverbal knowing, I can't help but wonder if the wisdom referred to in Prajnaparamita can only be understood by the right brain. While we may never have a definitive answer to this question, one thing is certain. There is a source of intelligence in the right brain that is beyond the capacity of the left brain interpreter to understand, and modern neuroscience is not the first to notice this. Over 100 years ago, the famous American psychologist William James wrote about a non-sensory type of intelligence he called fringe consciousness, which, according to James, describes a vague feeling of knowing that doesn't seem to have a direct sensory or perceptual content to it. For instance, if you've ever walked into a particular room for the first time and just felt it to be a great place to hang out, this experience is fringe consciousness. The idea is that you are simultaneously processing the whole room at once: the music, the art on the walls, the furniture, and the relations between the parts, into one vague feeling that you liked it. One possible way to explain this experience is to say that because interpretive consciousness is so limited, the fringe works by processing the whole context and then produces a general feeling of rightness or wrongness, sort of a summary statement about the big picture or all things collectively. Some of my favorite examples of fringe consciousness experiences from my own life have happened when I left the house and remembered that I've forgotten something but can't think of what it is, or when I've spotted someone I had met previously and just couldn't remember their name, despite being sure I knew it.
You should mention
James called these types of experiences tip-of-the-tongue events, since it is as if the content were right there, but because I can't say it, I can't quite produce that content. Students will often say that they know the answer on a test, but simply can't prove it right now. Brain imaging research has shown that during the tip-of-the-tongue moment, it is the right brain that lights up. And as you will see in this chapter, the right brain carries most of the weight for these nonverbal types of knowing. And one of the most interesting examples of this, and the most unexplained by Western science, is what we commonly refer to as intuition. Intuition. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines intuition as immediate apprehension or cognition without reasoning, and gaining direct knowledge or cognition without evident rational thought and inference. Based on this definition, you can see that intuition presents quite a quandary for the left brain interpreter. With intuition, knowing happens without explicitly being able to put into words how you know, or from where this knowing comes. You've likely experienced this in your own life in big and little ways. For instance, the forecast may be for sun all day, but something tells you that you'd better bring an umbrella. Then when a freak thunderstorm rolls in the afternoon, you say, I knew it. Intuition might lead a close friend or relative to know someone they care about is hurt or in trouble without ever receiving a phone call or text to that effect. There are several reported examples of people making life-saving decisions because they followed their intuition. Science and psychology are unable to explain how this works, which only means that they can't explain it via the left brain interpreter. Often, intuition is dismissed as being just a coincidence, but James saw that these experiences were too common to be explained as pure chance, but rather pointed to something that was occurring within us that the conscious mind wasn't fully aware of, hence the name of fringe. Not surprisingly, those who highly identify with the left brain interpreter will typically conclude that intuition is either silly or superstitious. While the interpretive mind doesn't trust intuition, I think intuition is another valid form of consciousness that the master has devalued, and as a result, many people have either lost touch with or don't trust this aspect of our consciousness. There have been some recent scientific studies regarding intuition that have measured this non-conscious, that is, not available to the left brain's language sphere, decision-making, and support the idea that intuition is a form of intelligence that, in some ways, is superior to left brain knowledge. In one study, participants were presented with 2 stacks of cards, $2,000, and a game in which the object was to win as much money as possible. They could choose a card from either stack and receive an immediate financial win or loss. The first stack had big wins, but also big losses, and the second stack had small wins, but almost no losses. Overall, playing from the second deck was the most advantageous. Here's the interesting part. It took 50 to 80 draws of cards before most subjects became conscious, meaning they noticed it with their left brain, of how the decks were rigged. However, researchers were also measuring the participants' sweat glands. They recorded that their palms produced sweat, a sign of nervousness, every time they reached for the first deck after only 10 cards. This meant that an unconscious intelligence arrived at the correct conclusion much earlier than the left brain interpreter. Even more interestingly, a handful of participants never consciously figured out that deck 2 was the best way to win. But even these participants experienced sweaty palms when reaching for the riskier deck. So for these participants, the right brain was aware of the correct choices, and the left brain never caught up. In another study designed to measure intuition's effect on decision-making, participants were presented with a video monitor that at first displayed only random dots, similar to what would be described as snow on an old TV. Unbeknownst to the participants' conscious minds, the researchers flashed emotion-provoking images, such as cute puppies, positive, or scary snakes, negative, and then asked participants to indicate if the dots were moving left or right on the screen. Not an easy task, given the subtleties of the movement. The type of image shown also correlated to the direction of the dots, so that positive images meant the dots moved one way, and negative images meant the dots moved another. The results were striking. Participants made much faster and more accurate decisions about the direction of the dots when the emotional images were appearing in the background. Remember, these images were unavailable to the interpreter, which never realized they were there. This study makes sense in the context of the right brain seeing the whole picture rather than just the parts, and being aware of things that aren't apparent to the left brain interpreter. It then influences the choices of the left brain, even without the left brain being aware of why it's making these choices. Perhaps this is intuition in a nutshell. The right brain senses information that isn't available to the left brain interpreter and sends it over in the form of what is described as an inspiration or gut feeling that the left brain can't quite put into words. And so it has reached the end of its ability to understand how it knows what it knows. Emotions. The right side of the brain is also the region primarily responsible for emotions, from joy to grief, happiness to sadness, and everything in between. This connection between intuition, emotion, and our physical bodies is apparent in the metaphor that describes intuitive nudges as gut feelings. In Western society, we are often told to choose logic over emotion, which is another way the left brain interpreter demands to play master. Most intelligence tests measure verbal ability and reasoning, so if your vocabulary is extensive, you will be at the top of the traditional IQ food chain. Of course, you could lack social intelligence, empathy, and even self-awareness, but these are largely unmeasured on such tests in a left-brain-dominated culture. You may even know someone who seems so smart you can't have a normal conversation with them, which speaks to the way we currently measure intelligence. Fortunately, this all began to change in the mid-1990s, when Daniel Goleman popularized the idea of emotional intelligence, or EQ, emotional quotient, in his book of the same name. EQ is defined as one's ability to recognize, understand, and manage their own emotions, as well as recognizing and understanding the emotions of others. In Goleman's more recent book, he looked at EQ and the brain and views EQ as consisting of 4 parts or elements: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. He also references 4 areas of the brain deeply involved in EQ, mostly on the right side. While it may be more obvious that we feel our way around in the last 2 parts of EQ, it might be more unusual to think about how self-awareness and self-management fit into this. So let me explain. A little after emotional intelligence came out, I published a research article on how individuals with greater influence from the right side of the brain are more self-reflective. The idea is pretty simple. If the left side of the brain creates an image of who we think we are, our egos, then the only way to reflect on this idea is from outside the system, which is the right brain. However, the right brain speaks only in emotions. So with self-reflection, we feel our way around thinking to find out what is true for us in a particular situation. One could argue that Zen Buddhists were some of the first to work at increasing EQ. While some may think that a Zen master is devoid of emotion, this is not true. It's not about lacking emotion. Rather, one could say that they have mastered their emotions because they do not fight them, and in this way they are free from them. There is an old Zen story about a student with an anger problem that illustrates this perfectly. The story goes that when the student expressed concern about his own bad temper to his master, the master said, "Show it to me." Of course, the student couldn't, and explained that it wasn't within his control to produce it at will, but rather it just happened. The master replied that if it wasn't within his control, then it was not part of his true nature. From that point on, whenever the student felt anger welling up inside of him, he recalled the master's words, and his anger began to subside. The advice to watch your emotions as they happen can increase your EQ because it puts space between the interpretive reaction and the emotion. It also teaches us not to fight or try and suppress our emotions, which is always a losing battle. Zen meditation instructs that when a distracting thought or emotion arises while meditating, one notices it and returns to the present moment. Consider the natural flow of emotions in an infant. Nothing is forced, and there are no good or bad emotions because there are no learned categories and no language. Years later, we judge that some emotions are good and should be sought out, while others are bad and should be avoided. In psychology, this eventually turned into the happiness movement, where people were desperately trying to find happiness by avoiding any and all negative emotions. Of course, nothing could be further from the practice of Zen. In Zen, there's no such thing as a wrong emotion, and therefore nothing to strive for or fight against. My students know very well not to tell me to have a nice day, because there's nothing wrong with a bad day or a bad mood. During a now famous lecture, the Eastern philosopher and spiritual teacher J. Krishnamurti asked the audience, "Do you want to know what my secret is?" According to several accounts of this story, in a soft voice he said, "I don't mind what happens." In the absolute acceptance of all emotions, they no longer have control over you because you have given up trying to control them. Perhaps a more accurate way to say this is that the interpretive mind has given up trying to control emotions, and in this way, it is no longer attempting to be master. Gratitude and compassion. Two emotions that can give us a special window to the right brain are gratitude and compassion. Most people agree these are virtuous traits that can help us live a more fulfilling life, and so we've come to understand them as ideals to strive for, or attributes that one must achieve. However, gratitude and compassion are innate in our being, as the experience of Dr. Jill Bolt Taylor, whom we met in a previous chapter, suggests. Taylor reported that during her stroke ordeal, she felt extremely compassionate and eternally optimistic. Because her stroke took her left brain offline, these feelings could only have come from her right brain, and this suggests that gratitude and compassion are already programmed into us. Perhaps we find them difficult to access amid the chatter of the left brain interpreter. While some accuse optimists of living in a fantasy world, being grateful is actually a deep appreciation for reality. Some studies have shown that feelings of gratitude activate the right side of the brain. But before we look at those, let's examine the opposite of gratitude, complaining, and where this may occur in the brain. Complaining is a popular and well-accepted form of social interaction. I don't mean being skeptical or offering constructive criticism. Those can be very helpful. By complaining, I mean objecting to things as they are in a way that isn't helpful, such as, "This cloudy weather is terrible." For our purposes, let's define complaints as statements that advocate the idea that things shouldn't be the way they are, or that this shouldn't have happened. As you can probably guess, whether said out loud or just in your head, complaints always stem from the interpretive mind. A complaint is strictly an interpretation of events, a story, and a negative judgment. For instance, statements such as, "This rain is ruining my day," or "I can't believe I got a flat tire," or "Traffic is horrible," are all examples reflecting a negative mindset rather than helpful criticism. We even have a popular conversational game in our culture, the worst day competition, in which people argue about who had the worst day, and in some strange way, the winner is the real loser. As you can imagine, and numerous studies have confirmed this, complaining leads to increased levels of anxiety and depression. When someone says, "This line is too long," or "Nothing ever goes my way," or "I wish I was someplace else," the statement becomes a belief, and the emotions consistent with the belief follow. In short, complaints turn into the belief that there is something wrong with reality. This often snowballs, as one complaint brings on a wave of emotion that
So in that process, you had the complaining it, followed by the belief it, followed by the emotional it. You had the verbal statement it, followed by the attitude it, followed by the emotional activity it.
influences other beliefs in turn, and more negative emotions result from those beliefs. All of these unhelpful complaints stem from an over-identification with left brain and the illusory self, for it is only the ego that can object to reality as it is. On the other side, gratitude is a reflection of the right brain. To be clear, being grateful goes beyond simple acceptance of reality, into the realm of being thankful for it. For instance, if the right brain could speak, rather than saying, "I accept the fact that it is raining," it might say, "I am so glad that it is raining." Research has determined there is greater activity in the right brain when subjects experience the sensations of gratitude. And another study found that subjects who were more grateful actually had more gray matter in certain parts of the right brain. In one study, subjects were randomly assigned to one of two
You know, I
groups.
mentioned I had one of those.
Oh yeah, it's over in the corner over here. What is it?
It's a
little tripod?
Yeah.
I'll just keep it.
Yeah,
Oh, thanks, bud.
First group regularly described 5 things they were grateful for, while the second group listed 5 things they felt were a hassle. After 10 weeks, the grateful group was more optimistic about the future, had fewer health complaints, and spent more exercise.
Oh shit.
In many ways, gratitude reflects every opposite quality of the interpreter.
Did I
We
rewind?
have a choice in our perspective. We can see things from a place of complaining, or once her stroke took her left brain offline, the was someplace else. The statement becomes a belief, and the emotions consistent with the belief follow. In short, complaints turn into the belief that there is something wrong with reality. This often snowballs, as one complaint brings on a wave of emotion that influences other beliefs in turn, and more negative emotions result from those beliefs. All of these unhelpful complaints stem from an over-identification with left brain and the illusory self, for it is only the ego that can object to reality as it is. On the other side, gratitude is a reflection of the right brain. To be clear, being grateful goes beyond simple acceptance of reality, into the realm of being thankful for it. For instance, if the right brain could speak, rather than saying, "I accept the fact that it is raining," it might say, I am so glad that it is raining. Research has determined there is greater activity in the right brain when subjects experience the sensations of gratitude. And another study found that subjects who were more grateful actually had more gray matter in certain parts of the right brain. In one study, subjects were randomly assigned to one of two groups. The first group regularly described 5 things they were grateful for, while the second group listed 5 things they felt were a hassle. After 10 weeks, the grateful group was more optimistic about the future, had fewer health complaints, and even spent more time exercising. In many ways, gratitude reflects every opposite quality of the interpreter. We have a choice in our perspective. We can see things from a place of complaining or one of gratitude. Oliver Sacks, one of my favorite writers in neurology, was well aware of this choice. When Sacks was facing his own death, he wrote a short book called Gratitude. In it he wrote, "I cannot pretend that I am without fear, but my predominant feeling is one of gratitude. I have loved, been loved, I have been given much, and I've given something in return. Above all, I have been a sentient being, a thinking animal on this beautiful planet, and that in itself has been an enormous privilege and adventure." Being grateful is a choice that brings us away from the left brain interpreter and into better alignment with the powers of the right brain. Compassion is also an area of the right brain. In Buddhism, compassion is often described as the ability to see another person as potentially ourselves, or to see the interconnectivity of all things. Compassion is all about the big picture, at which the right brain excels. I would add that true compassion only occurs when we can imagine ourselves in the position of another. Rebecca Sacks is a cognitive neuroscientist who spent quite a bit of time and energy exploring how the brain understands others' thoughts, and she may have found a part of the right brain that is critical in allowing us to experience compassion. To make this point, consider the following scenario as an experiment. Grace and Sally are taking a tour of a chemical plant. Grace walks over to the coffee maker to pour some coffee. Sally asks for some too, with sugar. The white powder next to the coffee machine is a deadly chemical accidentally left behind by a scientist, but the container is clearly marked sugar. Grace believes the white powder is sugar. She puts the substance into Sally's coffee. Sally drinks it and dies. How responsible is Grace for Sally's death? I will bet that you will not find her responsible at all, and it turns out that your right brain is critical in making this judgment. There is a section of the right brain called the right temporoparietal junction, RTPJ, that does nothing else except to think about other people's perspective. Sacks's research found that the more people can relate to the mind of Grace and understand that from her perspective she was innocent, the more active the RTPJ was. Alternately, when a magnetic pulse was applied to the RTPJ to disrupt its function, subjects were less able to consider the mind of Grace. As it turns out, the RTPJ isn't fully developed in kids, and they have a difficult time seeing things from others' point of view until this area matures. Anyone who has spent time around young children can attest to this, as it's virtually impossible for a 2 or 3-year-old to relate to the needs of his or her peers when it comes to sharing a coveted toy. Mythologist Joseph Campbell said this about compassion: "When real trouble comes, your humanity is awakened." Consider that many of us will run into a burning building to save a total stranger without a second thought, which is illogical to the left brain interpreter. Like it or not, our true self is more compassionate than the left brain can ever admit. Bringing the left brain's desire to be master into balance allows for extraordinary compassion and interconnection with others. Creativity. Another area that has long been associated with the right side of the brain is creativity. While there is some recent criticism of this in the neuroscience community as being overly simplistic, let's take a look quickly at why the right side of the brain has earned this distinction. In terms of neural wiring, the left and right sides of the brain differ in physical structure. The left brain has fewer connections, both within, but also to the rest of the brain. The right brain has more and longer fibrous connections both within itself and also to the rest of the brain. This greater neural connectivity allows the right brain to make novel connections between diverse ideas. Because of this, it is often labeled as the creative side of the brain. When most people think of creativity, they focus on traditional artistic pursuits, such as painting, sculpting, or writing. But the truth is that creativity applies to a much broader range of activities. For instance, here's a popular test of creativity that measures one's ability to make connections between things that seem, well, remote and distant. What is one word that connects the following three words? Widow, bite, monkey. If the
What do you got, buddy?
What's that?
What do you got, buddy?
What do you mean?
What's a word that connects those three?
Oh, sorry, I was miles away.
Widow,
fight, monkey.
bite, monkey, I think. Yeah, bite. Spider.
I was going to say spider.
Spider, monkey.
I was going to say spider.
Spider, monkey, that's why, right? Black widow, spider, bite, and monkey.
the word spider just popped into your mind, it is likely with the help of your right brain. This association is creative because the connections are not immediately obvious. In this way, creativity could be described as a form of intelligence in and of itself, one that has been instrumental in discoveries often associated with the left brain. For instance, Albert Einstein is one of the best-known scientists of all time, a master of a field that is based on logic and rational thinking. However, he was able to perceive the connection between moving in space and the slowing of time in a novel way that wasn't apparent to anyone else. Furthermore, many artists feel that their creativity is linked to their intuition. Author Ray Bradbury once said, "Your intuition knows what to write, so get out of the way." Filmmaker and artist David Lynch goes even further, saying that intuition is the key to everything. Painting, filmmaking, business, everything. I think you could have an intellectual ability, but if you can sharpen your intuition, a knowingness occurs. Beyond artists, there are many other notable examples of people who attribute some of their greatest successes to the power of their intuition, such as Steve Jobs, Oprah Winfrey, and Carl Jung. The areas of intuition, emotion, and creativity, right brain intelligence brings wisdom beyond words. Even as the left brain interpreter ignores or minimizes what goes on in its counterpart, it's impossible to deny the power and potency of the right brain, which provides life-changing insights, bursts of intuitive genius, and leaps of creative problem-solving. Explorations. A day without complaining. In my classes, I challenge students to see how long they can go without complaining, and then ask them to write about the results. I define complaining as finding some fault with reality. So again, simply being skeptical about something or offering a helpful critique doesn't count. This project has resulted in some of the most insightful student papers I have read in my career. I've had dozens of students point out what a surprise it was that complaining had become so habitual that they didn't even know it was going on. I've also had students tell me they love to complain and had not thought of changing things, which is also
not allowed to complain.
Many students admitted that they could not even make it to the end of class without some sort of complaint. While some students do believe they love to complain, more often I find that students become aware of more negative feelings after a long complaint
It's these
session.
great exploration sections where you
that
apply
complaining
what
had
we
become
learned
so
from the
habitual
chapter.
that they didn't even know it was going on. I've also had students, I challenge students to see how long they can go without complaining, and then ask them to write about the results. I define complaining as finding some fault with reality. So again, simply being skeptical about something or offering a helpful critique doesn't count. This project has resulted in some of the most insightful student papers I have read in my career. I've had dozens of students point out what a surprise it was that complaining had become so habitual that they didn't even know it was going on. I've also had students tell me they love to complain and had not thought of changing things, which is also a powerful insight. Many students admitted that they could not even make it to the end of class without some sort of complaint. While some students do believe they love to complain, more often I find that students become aware of more negative feelings after a long complaint session. Rather than feeling good or getting relief from letting off steam through long, drawn-out complaining with friends, most said they usually felt worse. Intuition tests. We've spent quite a bit of time on the underappreciated powers of the right brain, but it is by no means infallible. One of the most important questions for modern psychology is finding out when we should trust our intuition and when the left brain might rightly signal us to keep it in check or override it. In the 1970s, psychology spent some time showing us that our gut instincts can actually get us into trouble. Let me give one example. I will only tell you 4 things about Jim. Jim is short, thin, wears glasses, and likes to read poetry. Is Jim more likely A, an Ivy League English professor,
Conjunction
or
fallacy.
B, a truck driver? Where did your intuitive feelings guide you on this one? Did A just pop into your mind? Let's think about this, by which I mean apply some more rigorous linear reasoning. How many Ivy League English professors exist in the world? How many are short, thin, wear glasses, like to read poetry?
Representative heuristic.
Okay. Now, how many truck drivers are there worldwide? Even without knowing the exact... There are far more truck drivers, and therefore the true probability is far greater that Jim is a truck driver. Here's another example. Imagine you are at the roulette wheel, and it has come up red for the last 5 spins. Where do you put your money for the next spin? Red or black?
Gambler's fallacy.
The gambler's fallacy is when people believe they should shift to black because after so many red spins, it feels like it is now more probable that the next one will be black. However, in reality, each spin is unaffected by the previous ones. Numerous other examples have shown that when we use our gut, we are prone to stereotypes, overgeneralizations, and guesswork that can really take us down a bad path. So while intuition is documentable and real, it is also something we can't produce at will. And as the truck driver and gambler examples show, we have to be careful not to rely on it erroneously. Perhaps particularly in the West, where the left brain interpreter master does not honor the gift of the intuitive mind, very few people learn to develop this form of knowing or put systems in place to guard against its pitfalls. Call on intuition for a big decision. Have a big decision to make? One study suggests that when making major purchases, in this study participants were purchasing automobiles, those who did so based on an intuitive nudge or gut feeling were ultimately happier with the outcome than those who spent a long time deliberating. The next time you have a major decision to make, take note of your initial gut feeling regarding it. As this study suggests, you should likely follow it. Your right brain may have big picture information of which you, that is the left brain interpreter, are not fully conscious that will affect the outcome of your choice. Chapter 7. What is consciousness? To the one who perceives all beings as the self, there will be no more delusion or grief. The Upanishads. So far in this book, we have looked at evidence from neuropsychology that supports important ideas of Buddhism and other Eastern philosophical traditions, namely that the self we all take for granted is in fact an illusion, and that this illusion is the cause of much, if not all, of the mental suffering we experience as humans. This can be difficult to consider, especially because the left brain interpreter is not only convincing in its illusionary nature, but also working feverishly to prevent its fiction from being realized. We've also spent some time looking at the right side of the brain, and found that even though it is silent in terms of verbal thought, and is therefore labeled unconscious by the left brain interpreter, it has an intelligence all its own. Furthermore, in the areas of finding meaning and understanding the whole, it is the conscious left brain that must rely on the unconscious right. Whether or not you're convinced by this evidence, I do think there's one thing we can all agree on, and that is the fact that we are conscious. In other words, humans share what we could call a sense of perception that none of us can deny. Because our sense of self feels so central to our consciousness, what would it mean for a consciousness if the self were indeed a fiction? As a matter of background, contemporary neuroscience has one belief above and beyond all others, and that is that consciousness is localized in the brain. Brain-specific localization, traditional neuroscience assumes that consciousness itself is also individual. That is, it exists separately in separate brains. In other words, I have my consciousness, you have yours. And in this sense, the interpretive mind thinks and acts as if it owns consciousness. While the brain and consciousness are clearly connected, if you shook my head long enough, I would become dizzy, this may not tell the whole story. After all, the world isn't flat simply because it appears so in Kansas. Consider the work of author and researcher Rupert Sheldrake, who is taking science to task by questioning many of its unnecessary assumptions, one of which is that consciousness is locked up in the skull.
You're familiar with Rupert Sheldrake? Oh, well, this is where it gets a bit wonky.
What is he? Does he think that consciousness is an illusion or not?
He thinks that it's like a real thing, ethereal space.
Oh boy.
Well, we'll see what he's talking about. He's got some weird ideas.
What are you talking about? Some quantum stuff?
Sheldrake believes that consciousness can extend beyond the skull and is more akin to what he calls a more. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, in the scientific world, a field isn't flat simply because it appears so in Kansas. Consider the work of author and researcher Rupert Sheldrake, who is taking science to task by questioning many of its unnecessary assumptions, one of which is that consciousness is locked up in the skull.
Oh boy.
Sheldrake believes that consciousness can extend beyond the skull and is more akin to what he calls a morphic field. For those of you unfamiliar with the term, in the scientific world, a field refers to a kind of invisible force that does not have the same properties or act the same way that material objects do. Morphic fields stick to or surround a material object. For instance, think of how a magnetic field extends beyond the magnet itself. You can cut up the magnet into as many pieces as you like, but the magnetic field...
All mental processes are synaptic events. Synaptic events do not extend beyond the synapse.
Still preserved because the field itself is holistic and cannot be dissected. Animals which lack the developed left brain interpreter of humans may offer some evidence that consciousness extends outside the brain. Sheldrake points out that cats often know and dread when it is time to go to the vet and will hide from their owner. Of course, owners will counter with strategies that minimize cues that it is time to go to the vet. But the cat's still preserved because the field itself is holistic and cannot be dissected. Animals which lack the developed left brain interpreter of humans may offer some evidence that consciousness extends outside the brain. Sheldrake points out that cats often know and dread when it is time to go to the vet.
That's our interpretation.
Of course, owners will counter with strategies that minimize cues that it is time to go to the vet. But the cats still seem to know.
Yeah, okay.
Of the 65 pet clinics he contacted, 64 stated that it is extremely common for cat owners to miss their appointments because the owner couldn't find the cat. In the 65th clinic, it was so common that they gave up the practice of having appointments altogether. Pet owners will often attest that their pets seem to know when a member of the family is coming home, or when someone is about to come to the front door. In my own case, we have a 5-pound neurotic dog in our house, and my wife is the center of his universe. For years, I noticed that our dog always seemed to know when my wife was coming home, and he would start to run in circles, run to the window, then run in circles again. What caught my attention is when he would do this at times when there were no cues that she was coming home. That is, her arrival was unexpected. For example, she forgot something and had to turn around, and our dog would know before I did. However, to be valid science, one has to make sure we are not just remembering the hits and forgetting the misses. Sheldrake conducted a careful study on such occurrences where pet owners would randomly get a call to head home. The owners would then head home in a taxi, making sure that there were no other cues that they were on their way. What he found was that the animals began to act excited at the exact point when the intentions of the owner were to head home.
No way, come on.
This suggests some sort of connection between the consciousness of the pet and its owner. In a final anecdote from the animal world, a chicken became known as Miracle Mike in the mid-20th century after it survived an attempted beheading on the chopping block, although the only thing left above the neck...
We still have to be Bayesian. What does it mean to be Bayesian, Dad?
I don't remember.
Bayes' theorem says that you adjust your priors to form your posterior credence level, account of the probability of something. You adjust from your priors. So you have your priors, your sense of how likely something is. You have a new piece of information. You consider the commonness and the reliability of this piece of information, and then use it to adjust your priors. You never throw out your priors, and you don't forget false positives, and you don't forget the commonness. So, okay, that experiment by itself would say, holy shit, we need to rethink the whole nature of reality. Apparently, psychological events can just fly through space like that. But that means throwing out a lot of priors. So we might need another few experiments to adjust our priors.
Was the brainstem in one ear, the chicken was kept alive by his owner, who, seeing his resiliency, decided to spare the chicken and put food and water directly into his neck via an eyedropper. Mike lived for another 2 years with no head, otherwise walked and behaved normally, and even toured with a circus. In Mike's case, it would seem impossible to argue that its consciousness was in the brain. If we allow for a moment the idea that consciousness does extend beyond the brain, it might also explain some of the phenomena currently called psychic or paranormal. Notice if your left brain has a dismissive reaction to these terms, which is common in the scientific community. One example of such phenomena is what Stanford researchers Russell Targ and Harold Puthoff called remote viewing, or the ability to see, in the mind's eye only, distant targets and locations. A program to study and develop remote viewing techniques was actually funded by the U.S. government's Central Intelligence Agency in the 1970s and 1980s. Remote viewing is just a fancy term for what parapsychology calls clairvoyance. The word itself comes from the French terms for clear and vision, and refers to the ability to gain information about a person, object, or event via a form of extrasensory perception. Being able to sense something that lies beyond the reach of your physical senses might well mean that your consciousness also goes to this distant place. If we take examples of psychic ability as having a kernel of truth, then I think it suggests consciousness does extend, at least for some people, and in some instances, outside of the brain. Furthermore, perhaps intuition can also...
Let me just give you a bit of context. This guy is a neuropsychologist, research neuroscientist. Here's the thing. His dad died, and he was all broken up about it, and so he went into Buddhism to find some comfort. So, thanks to his exposure to Buddhism, he was able to realize that the self is an illusion. Unfortunately, we see that he didn't realize that consciousness is also an illusion, and fully accepted their ideas about consciousness and the self, even though only one of those or both of those are illusions, and both as indicated by science.
By illusion, you don't mean it doesn't exist.
I mean that it exists as an illusion, that the illusion exists, but we misunderstand what it is. We misattribute properties to it that it doesn't necessarily have. We consider it a phenomenon rather than a sum of qualities.
Explained in part by the idea that consciousness extends outside the brain. While these ideas are
This is how you
speculative,
sound.
there is one thing I can confirm without a doubt.
I'm making a joke.
And that is that in spite of the best efforts and best technologies modern science has to offer, the neuroscience community has not located consciousness in the brain. Perhaps the simple...
And I became suspicious as soon as you started talking about this reliable intuition. Yes, he later said that it's fallible, but that almost seemed like an afterthought about not counting the hits and ignoring the misses and all that stuff. He really seems to believe that there's some kind of we're plugged into truth, but only the right brain is, and the left brain, truth is shrouded from it.
Reason for this is that consciousness is not there to be found. What if the brain is connected to, or a part of, consciousness, rather than a possessor of consciousness? If consciousness arises from the brain simply tapping into a larger field of consciousness, rather than existing as an object within the brain, then, like our sense of self, it begins to look and feel more like a verb than a noun. Nouns are solid and immobile, while verbs are fluid and active. Verbs move across space and time and are difficult to localize. Perhaps every morning, consciousness tunes into 7 billion brains. After waking, this consciousness would have access to particular memories and 7 billion unique perspectives, each its own pilot, and the interpreter would be reborn.
He started talking about
Perhaps
research.
this is exactly what happened this morning. Perhaps consciousness would identify as that unique person and never suspect it wasn't that person, just like you think you are you right now. If this is the case, then perhaps the idea of consciousness as an observer, which is often mentioned in spiritual circles, should be understood more accurately as simply an observance. If this were true, it would upend our most fundamental belief. Of all the ideas that we have discussed, the idea that consciousness sits behind the eyes and between the ears feels rock solid for most of us. This experience is tied directly to the illusion of an inner self. These ideas work together, and the result is that it feels like there is a me from inside the skull. I hope you are beginning to consider that both of these ideas, individual consciousness and the self, might well be illusions. As a final note on consciousness, modern science rests on the assumption that material things like brains are primary. By this I mean that scientists think that a brain and only a brain can give rise to consciousness. But here again, is it possible that the opposite is true? Is consciousness giving rise to matter? This is what so many Eastern philosophical schools tell us, and if they are right about the non-existence of the self, is it possible that they are right about this too? Advaita Vedanta teacher Nisargadatta Maharaj said, "You are not in the world, but the world is in you. It is only a result of consciousness." This idea begins to sound a whole lot like the Heart Sutra again, where emptiness, space, gives rise to form, matter. While a full discussion of this topic is beyond the scope of this book, it does leave us with something to ponder. Explorations. Consciousness misdirected. The next two exercises show how easy it is to shift the relationship between consciousness and the body, suggesting that consciousness is more pliable and less rooted in the brain than we might think. The first is simple enough to set up in my classroom. I ask two students to sit in chairs, one right behind the other, with both students facing the same direction. Student A is in the back, facing student B's back. I then have both students either close their eyes or don a blindfold. As the experimenter, I take student A's right hand with my right and guide their index finger to tap the nose of student B, who is seated in front of them. At the same time, I also use my left hand to tap on student A's nose. I control the tapping so that they are in perfect synchrony. Consider the message being sent to student A's brain. My hand is 2 feet in front of me, touching a nose. Incredibly, and without fail, student A's brain then makes a radical revision based on the physical evidence. It assumes its own real nose is 2 feet long. Afterward, student A sometimes reports that they felt their nose slowly grow 2 feet, and sometimes it seems to have grown instantly. The experience is often so profound and surprising that even in a room full of others, student A will let out a scream. There is another form of this illusion I've used in the lab. You need a fake rubber hand, you can easily procure these at Halloween stores, a table, and a large piece of cardboard. The subject sits at a table and puts their hand out such that the cardboard is upright and they can't see their hand. The fake hand is put right in front of them, resting in a way that their own hand might naturally.
What are you going to talk about?
Now the experimenter asks them to look at the fake hand while they give a series of taps and short strokes to both the fake hand and the subject's real hand, randomly and in perfect synchrony. Again, imagine the messages in the brain of the subject. I'm looking at a fake rubber hand that is being tapped exactly the same time as my own hand. Then the subject's brain makes a radical revision. The fake hand is actually mine. The subject actually relocates consciousness into the fake rubber hand. Once the illusion is felt, the experimenter can do anything from smash the fake hand with a hammer to injecting it with a long needle. In past experiments, the reaction to this was just as if the subject had experienced the real pain of having their real hand smashed.
You just associated the visual and
Dr. V.S. Ramachandran, the neuroscientist mentioned earlier in the book, has created an interesting treatment for people experiencing the sensation of phantom limbs. People who have lost a limb sometimes have the strange sensation that the limb is still there. In the worst circumstance, the phantom limb is experiencing pain.
And Ramachandran and Francis Crick aren't going to be agreeing with you about consciousness being outside of the skull. They like the idea of the claustrum.
In one example, the patient's phantom hand had such a tightly closed fist that the phantom nails were digging into the hand, causing extreme distress. But how can medical science deal with pain in a limb that doesn't even exist? Ramachandran believed that by tricking the patient's brain, he could bring some relief. He set up a box with mirrors, such that when the patient put their attached hand into an opening, mirrors made it look like the patient actually had two hands. The missing hand was supplanted by a reflection of the remaining hand. The patient put in his existing hand and opened a closed fist. All the brain, or perhaps consciousness, needed to see was the phantom hand open up its clenched fist, and the pain was gone. Test your psychic abilities. This exploration is a fun way to test the idea for yourself that consciousness may extend outside the skull. You'll need a deck of cards, a quiet room, and 4 or more friends to join you. To begin, take 5 cards at random from the deck and place them face up on a table. Next, choose one person who will be the receiver and ask them to leave the room for a moment. The remaining members of the group, the senders, pick one of the 5 cards as the choice card. Invite the receiver back into the room and don't share which card the group has chosen. Ask all of the senders to be silent and make no eye contact with the receiver, as the receiver holds his or her hand over each card to see if the correct card can be felt. Here's the last step. When the receiver has their hand over the wrong card, every member of the sender group should say the word no silently in their minds only, as if they were sending the receiver a message. When the receiver has a hand over the correct card, the sender should say the word yes in their mind only, to let the receiver know that...
I assure you, Darren Brown does not believe that when he puts his hand on someone's shoulders, he says, think of your PIN number, and then says the PIN number. I promise you, he does not believe he is receiving their consciousness.
is the card the group selected. The receiver should
Randy, what's that guy's name? You know what I'm talking about? The guy, the guy who revealed all the tricks that psychics and stuff use.
And is looking for a subtle difference in feeling over each card. Finally, the receiver will make a selection. Statistically, if this is all meaningless, the choice will be right 20% of the time, given there are 5 cards. I have a friend who does this with groups regularly, and he says the percentages are almost always higher than that, with some groups guessing correctly 80% of the time. While this is hardly a scientific study, it is a fun way to test this ability for yourself. Chapter 8. Finding the Real You. Everything will come all right for you.
You gonna let you move over?
Yeah. Come on, hurry the fuck up.
We should let you move over and see what's going on.
So, Dad, if the fundamental unit of the brain might be the synapse, or again, even literally speaking, you could talk about the synapse between two networks. Synapse between two cells, the synapse between two networks. Or you can look at the fundamental unit as the neuron, but then it might be relevant when you're talking about cognition to be looking at from one dendrite to another terminal, even if there are several synapses between. So it might be a series of neurons and talking about a network and the involvement of a network, of a module. Anyway, so the fundamental unit of the brain is an input-output mechanism with a neuron with a receiving end and ascending end. What is the fundamental unit of the mind? If you want to talk about the interaction between reaction mechanisms, what do we call those?
Is that it?
Good job, buddy. Thank you. I appreciate that enormously. Well, I've had a lovely visit.
I've had a lovely visit.
An important visit. Very good. Thank you, buddy. Respond to, or there are emotional its. Then it's triggered by those emotional its. There are yits, informational its, and it's triggered by those. Anyway.
The base self, which responds to emotion.
It's just I just think it's the wrong way to look at it. The base self responds to emotions. If you said the base self is no, still it's so much more complicated than that. It's, I mean, no, but okay, you could say, like, you could describe sort of the amygdala and the limbic system as a sort of, department of its as a self. But it's just the whole responding to, no, just doing. I don't know, man. I'm confused right now. And I keep thinking about the processor hypothesis, what I call the processor hypothesis, which is I fucked up how I'm doing this video. I don't want to interrupt the dash cam footage to do this. Just like a neuron, we have vocabulary related that's specific to that, such as excitation, inhibition, threshold, action potential, stuff like that, right? Can't just use normal words to describe a thing that normal words weren't made to describe, right? You need new vocabulary. Okay. Now, it might be useful to borrow some of that vocabulary to talk about in the interaction between its, or to adjust some of it so that we know what we're talking about and what context we're talking. So it's valuable work being done.
Right.
So this is a separate video, and I'll just put that clip before it. But I want to address this in the video. I don't know what to do. I'm confused, bro. So, all right, hold on. Processor hypothesis is basically a way to frame, to understand consciousness. We were really confused. How do we experience what the brain is doing? Or how does the brain produce these things, put these things on our projector screen that we experience? How, blah, blah. And there's an assumed distance there, So while you guys are asking, wow, this is amazing. Look at this screen. How we're seeing this movie of life. And it's just like brain shit. Wow. And then my question to you is, what do you think the projector is experiencing? Is that right? Never mind the people in the room. Okay, yeah, they're watching this movie that the projector is sending, right? What do you think the projector is seeing itself? What do you think it's seeing? And you're supposed to go, oh, well, it's seeing what it's projecting. And then you're supposed to go, oh shit, what if we're actually the projector? And we're not actually projecting. We're just fucking playing, we're just doing the movie. You are not a special audience. You are actually the processor. Should we change it to the projector hypothesis? No, because then it's like, what if you are the projector? And it's like, but what do you mean projecting to whom then? You just said there's really sort of no audience. Well, we're projecting to the rest of us. Yeah. You're the projector. We're watching. You're the machine projecting it. And we're the cameras watching it, I guess. I don't know. So okay, so if we have the processor hypothesis, then we can have the projector myth. But I would want the word of the myth to be describing the viewer. The processor hypothesis versus the perceiver myth. There's no fucking perceiver, bro. I mean, we're seeing ourselves. But we're the processor, bro. And we're just processing ourselves. And like the way he distinguishes between thought and emotion. Like there's a moment where he said, there's no thought. So there's no verbal, there's no verbal event, we could say. But what is a thought? Is a thought just verbal stuff? Okay. If you want to define a thought as just verbal stuff, sure. But here's what I think is happening. I think you're defining verbal stuff as conscious stuff. And you're distinguishing, you're just saying that all thoughts are these conscious events. And all thoughts are verbal constructions where it's actually sort of or it doesn't necessarily have to where there's audio, but where at least it's a near verbal association or organization of ideas.
I mean, the sun must be. I mean, look how big the sun is, and it's 93 million miles away. Can you imagine the size of the sun?
I cannot.
So how big would that look in the sky if you were half as close to it as we are now?
So what's that called? Not the rotational, the angular size. Does that something to do with it?
What's that?
The angular size, is that relevant? No.
Could you imagine being on a planet where the sun is huge?
So it's like a complicated enough association of ideas. You know, blank and blank, but blank because blank. Or even if they're not actual words, those concept associations are happening. So it's near linguistic because it's complicated enough where it would be useful, where words would come in handy now. Would start coming in handy now, where you can't really get much farther without. I don't know. Anyway, so I think that's what he calls thoughts. And those are the conscious mind. But if we say that thoughts aren't just verbal, so it's not just the most sort of complicated of mental events, or I mean of simultaneous. I don't know why that's true to say that's like the most, but I mean of experienced mentally. No, I don't know why that's true to say. Okay. In any case, there's this boundary. All right, you want a challenge? Tell me one Warsaw illusion. And now to help you, the Warsaw illusions form the acronym WERSOSO. WERSOSO.
Oh.
So maybe W, maybe the E, maybe the R, maybe the first SO, maybe the second SO.
Oh my God. I can't think of anything right now. So.
What about, you can think of one. With the two SOs, the S word is single. There's single something and single something. Single observer and single agent, single doer. How would you say that with an O? Single observer and single.
Oh,
Huh?
what? I'm sorry, I can't think straight. I can't think.
I see that. Okay, I believe you now. I believe you now.
I can't think the
Yeah, I believe you now. All right, there's this boundary for him between that which emanates from the physical world, some of which transcends to that which sort of descends from the heavens. This conscious mind, this free will agent interacting with this physical automatic world. And I know that exists in him, that concept, that is sort of the basis of much of his thinking, or his responses on these questions. For instance, one time I remember what was it? He like tossed me something that he shouldn't have tossed me. A camera or something. And I think maybe I caught it or something. I don't really know. It wasn't a camera. I don't know. But anyway, that gives you the idea. And I was surprised. And he says, I didn't mean to do that. I didn't mean to do that. I, representing, I suppose, all of this. Or is it representing a conscious mind? And we don't know. Did not have the intention of that action. But I did produce that action. So depending on how we define intention, but if it's just like the concept of an action that will achieve a goal, if it's been, maybe if the antilivery was goal thinking, I need someone who's an expert in neuroanatomy, bro. But if we define intention as being, a mental, if we define intention, I didn't mean to do that. Let's first suppose that when we say I didn't mean to do that, we're saying I did not intend to do that. And let's say we define intention as all right, so we have an action, throwing the phone or whatever. Throws the phone. Now that action had to be preceded by something. It could have been preceded by a muscle spasm, in which case we would not describe that as intention because the muscle spasm was not coming from the goal concept. If the goal is to give them the phone, it's funny, even that you literally could just have an aberrant efferent signal, sort of, or where the thought happens to throw it. Most of it's inhibited. Still, little acetylcholine gets released. Anyway, we can dismiss that because it landed like in my hands, I think. I don't know. It wasn't a problem. I don't know what he did. Maybe it wasn't that at all. What did he throw? I made a video about it, so just look at that. Anyway, okay. But in case you haven't seen that, he says, I didn't mean to do that. I don't know how to define intention. Especially because I think that the more we learn about the biological events, the better we'll be able to define this thing we call intention. So I think we can just loosely define it as that which precedes and anticipates. No. Oh, how do you say an intention exists there? So there is a future state envisioned and a motor plan to arrive at that future state. or a motor preparation, or preparing of the motor system to arrive at that future state. Anyway, whatever he did, I don't remember what it was. It came from that. It came from, here's what needs to happen. Eris needs to have that, whatever I'm tossing him. And here's a way to do it. Run some arm commands. Boom. Okay. So I don't know what he means by I, but there was intention somewhere. So here's what I told him. I said, part of you meant to do that. So you could think of it as that whole sequence happened, and another part reacted to it, went, what's going on? Did we just throw that camera? That is not a good way to achieve the goal. That is not something that we approve of. That is not a good prepared motor sequence for the future state that we are looking for. We did not mean to do that. So the I who spoke, actually, that was true. This part that is now speaking to you, Eris, never had that plan. So then Eris actually is wrong to say a part of us had that plan. Oh, a part of all of us in this skull, yes. But none of we who was just talking to you saying we didn't mean that, we didn't mean to do that. That was these guys, these fools. So I said a part of you speaking to the whole sit stem, not speaking to the its that had just spoken to me. And some other its in the same department, but no need to think it would be the same its. Some other its were like, yo, yeah, we get that. And it's so funny to picture these its talking. They're basically cells, kind of, or arrangements of cells. And they're like, with brain cells. And here's what they sent to me. They said, yo, that's right. I didn't mean to do that. That was just a few its speaking for the whole brain. My brain meant to do that. And it's just like, look in the mirror, bro. What do you think you are? What are you talking about? What are you talking about? So anyway, all right. So I know that's real. I know that's how Pop sees shit. And I know he doesn't know that he sees it that way. And I think it's because literally every time I try to talk to him, I'm talking to completely different teams of it, different selves, bro. Because, or I'm just always talking to one negative guy. But when but it's like, but because he was like, what's the point of doing your interviews? Of course we know that we're brains. He does not. Foxtrot 03 Alpha 2024 Fober 03 Aldi 0750. So could you have like a periodic table of the most elemental its? I don't know whether I will achieve any draft of that. But I wonder whether you could identify, say, 150 elemental its. No, probably not, huh? Maybe, and you can do that. Every it is ultimately some kind of variation or combination of those. There we go. Mission successful, ain't
Maybe.
you? Got to explain it theory to father. And he no longer thinks on having a manic episode like he did. Going down a rabbit hole where I think I'm gonna win the Nobel Prize for some crackpot shit. His thing wasn't necessarily crackpot, it was just I think he thought it was of more consequence than it was. But basically, he was just looking at Euler's number and the ratio and the leaves and stuff. Oh, fuck. Oh, thanks, pal. Oh, fuck. That's not what I was supposed to do? Oh, damn it. It's not a big deal, right? It's the same thing, isn't it? I am confused, actually. Oh, this is what I was supposed to do. Right. Anyway, go back to listening to some reading or some shit. Oh no, that's what we're doing.
This is Audible. No self, no problem. How neuropsychology is catching up to Buddhism.
Shut the
Written
fuck
by
up.
Chris Niebauer, PhD. Narrated by Charlie Varon. Note to the listener. Some of the exercises in this book involve meditation, movement, and/or deep reflection that are finding the real you. Everything will come all right for you in the end. Ramana Maharishi. Every semester, at least one student will ask me, sometimes in clear distress, if my left brain interpreter is a fiction, who is the real me? I'll make an attempt to answer that question as I do for them, but before I do, I want to remind you that this is always what the left brain interpreter asks. That's because the interpreter loves conclusion, certainty, and has a constant need to think about it all. And this question is an example of the very process that creates and sustains the fiction it has established. Turning to the right brain, perhaps it already knows the answer, or it doesn't much care. Another possibility is that the real you, whoever that is, loves a mystery. Either way, I will do my best to respond to this question using a method that will appeal to both sides of the brain. A simple story. In the East, there is a classic tale about a hide-and-seek told by various masters, but they all go something like this. In the beginning, there was only God,
Oh,
so
fuck
God
me.
had no one to play with except God. Therefore, God created a game of hide-and-seek, but the only way he could do this was to pretend that he was who he wasn't,
Oh, boy.
and that he wasn't who he was. In other words, God could only play this game by forgetting himself. God got lost in each of us and in all of our drama in order to experience adventure, even if this sometimes turns out terribly. Even the worst suffering is like a bad dream, and it is all over when God wakes up. Imagine that you were an all-powerful and all-knowing entity, and your existence is only eternal bliss. Would you choose this existence if you could? What if the only way to make things interesting would be to hide from what you are, or to be exactly what you are not, in a game of pretend? Suddenly, the game would be afoot, and there would be great drama and excitement in finding yourself. Of course, you could never know if this was a game, or it wouldn't work. Would you want to watch a movie without conflict, a villain, and a challenge to overcome, featuring characters that have no goal and nothing to achieve? In this movie, things are fine just as they are. The actors sit in meditative bliss, or go for walks in nature, or hold hands, all while we watch. It is difficult to imagine such a movie, and more so to think you might enjoy it. Even with the best actors and special effects, it would likely be a record-setting flop. How much fun would it be to gamble in a casino that you own? There would be no way to really win, because if you did win, you would lose, and if you lost, you'd still win. The only way to have fun in your own casino is to forget that you are the owner. Only then would the wins be a rush and the losses seem tragic, even if neither was really the case. While it may sound strange to suggest that this is what's happening to us, I think, or rather I feel, that this story points to the true nature of our existence. Perhaps an all-powerful eternal force would do exactly what is happening right now, hiding from itself in billions of ways, within you right now, reading this text, unaware of its essence, and at the same time realizing everything is in perfect harmony.
Oh my goodness.
All play, all adventure requires a challenge that must be overcome, or an evil force that must be fought against and destroyed. The Christians call this evil or sin. The Buddhists call it the three poisons: fear, greed, and delusion. The Freudians call it the id, and Jung called it the shadow. But it's the same mechanism woven into the fabric of a universe intent on play and an unending mystery. The issue with any game, even this grand universe game, is that unless there is a possibility of defeat, and it has to be real defeat, there is no game. The grand game of all games is the game of life and death. If death didn't seem real, the game would be meaningless. Death seems like a real, genuine defeat, because if it didn't, we would lose interest in the game. I remember when my son was young, and I would chase him, pretending that I was a monster. He would yell over and over again, laughing, "A monster is going to get me." Likewise, I would hold him,
while knowing there's no doubt.
my lap, and we would play the game of "Don't Let Me Go," with both of us laughing over and over, and each time I would extend him a little farther and make the game a little more exciting. This is the early form of drama without the seriousness we give it later in life, when we forget that the original nature of drama is to play. As adults, our monsters become very real, taking such forms as financial ruin, loneliness, job loss, sickness, and death. As adults, we've come to really believe that monsters can get us, and that we will be devastated by this. Somehow, a game that started with a built-in safety valve and the inability to stop laughing ends up in stress, depression, and anxiety. Not coincidentally, as our bodies get older, our sense of self becomes more established, and our propensity to experience mental suffering grows too. Next, consider this. What if the way to win the game of life is to discover experientially that it's all a game in the first place, and that you are the creator of the game? I emphasize the experience of this discovery, and I suggest that this is what happened to the Buddha, Lao Tzu, and other ancient masters from the East so long ago. In their case, identification with the self collapsed, and so did all the mental suffering that went with it. If mental suffering has any benefit, perhaps it is to help you wake up to the game, to the grand drama that is this existence. As it is put in Buddhism, when there is no mud, there is no lotus flower. The Buddha was supposedly protected from suffering early in life, and if he had never ventured out to explore suffering, he would have never had his insights. If not for your suffering, you would not be where you are right now. Let's conclude with a few explicit pointers on playing this cosmic game. One way to play the game is to dismiss or forget the ideas presented here, and continue to believe that the left brain is in fact you. You keep your identity and keep playing a role in this theatrical world we call modern society. In this realm of categories and interpretations, there are good days, but there are also bad days. There are friends, but also enemies. In this left-brain world, you can win, but sometimes you will lose. There's the thrill of victory, but also the anxiety over defeat. The game is played with a dreadful sense of seriousness and urgency, as if it isn't a game at all. Of course, there are some downsides in this approach. Life is viewed as short. Death and disease are the enemy, and you must work as hard as you can for as long as possible, trying to win with the most possible credits, be they material or spiritual. Like most of us, your actor ego is likely cast as only an extra in the background of the world's stage, but there's always the chance for stardom, and for that chance, many accept the suffering. There's nothing wrong with this choice, and currently and historically, it is the most popular option on the planet. In a way, for those who are totally ignorant of all these ideas, we could say that they are playing the game so well that their left brains should be congratulated. Going to the other extreme, another option would be to wholeheartedly pursue activities associated with the right side of the brain, in a search for what many refer to as enlightenment. Taking this option to the fullest means following a path similar to the saints, masters, and monks of the world's great spiritual.
Well, there we go. Obviously went off the deep end there at the end. Talking absolute nonsense about traveling, you know. But we definitely learned a lot, though. I still accept the things that he said about sort of right brain consciousness and stuff. I think those things sing for me.